So the question for this morning is, how are we as the people of God to relate well to each other? And I don't mean how do we not relate badly. I mean, how do we relate well? I got on a bus this week. I think I related well to the driver. I said good morning as I got on. I said thank you as I got off. I think I related well to him. But if that's all I do to you, if that's all we do with each other, John 13, Jesus says, "By this everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another." How do we love one another in such a way that the rest of the world will be wowed and they say, gosh, they must love Jesus because only Jesus loves like that? We're picking up in our series on 1 Timothy. You remember Paul is writing to Timothy, a church leader in Ephesus, modern day Turkey, and his concern throughout his letter is that his people mature and grow in godliness. And for the rest of the letter, Paul gets very practical indeed, hence today's title, Godliness towards each other in practice, and my first heading, Getting our relationships right. Paul writes, verse 1, "Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity." Instantly, we note the language of family. I go into Tesco and I spot a shop assistant. His job is to assist me, to serve me, and to encourage me to buy lots of things from Mr. Tesco. I spot a fellow consumer. We're both there to look for what we desire, to get what we need. If you're me, to hunt out the bargains on the leftovers counter. But we see in verses 1 and 2 a fundamentally different category of relationship, don't we? How am I to relate to you? What is my responsibility towards you? No, we're not fellow consumers here to have our wants satisfied. I am to treat you either as I would treat my mum or dad, with the corresponding honour and respect and care they are rightly due, or as I would my brother or my sister, with the corresponding love and responsibility that I owe to them. Now, I know in this fallen world, none of us have perfect families, but we all have some inkling of what Paul is saying here. Indeed, we look at Jesus, we look at how he honoured his heavenly Father, how he honoured his earthly parents, how he honoured his disciples, who he called brothers and sisters. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. How do we sometimes see older people treated? We see them shouted at or sidelined or ignored. But honouring our father and mother means neither getting frustrated or impatient or rude, nor letting them just get on with it, letting them just make their own bed and lie in it. There is a time for us to rebuke, not harshly, but gently, to exhort and encourage and say, "Really, Dad? Now, more senior members of our congregation, I think I would caution you about calling them dad. But we have a responsibility towards them, don't we? And we'll come to this later. We're also wise to listen to them very, very carefully. Verse 1, do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Sorry to pick on people. So I say sorry to pick on people. You know I'm not sorry at all. But Dan, a guy in his 20s at our 9 o'clock congregation, how am I to relate to him? Fraser and Ewan, how am I to relate to you? I am to treat you, I am to treat Dan as a brother. By inference, how rightly do I treat the guys in there? How rightly do I treat the growing number of children in our congregation? Well, if I treat their mums as a sister, then nephews, nieces, does that work? Interestingly, some of you may remember this from the past. Often in our churches in the past, children would call older church members auntie or uncle. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Doesn't this define the nature of our relationships? You're not a shop assistant, you're not a bus driver. You're my brother, you're my sister, you're my mum, my dad, and the honour they have. But just that word of warning at the end of verse 2. I am to treat my brother or sister with absolute purity. There are real dangers in our church life which we are naive and foolish to ignore. Tragically, just 2 weeks ago, one of our archdeacons in the diocese was sacked because of a relationship that overstepped the mark. Now, had that archdeacon put the person that he was involved in with the category of sister, had that woman put him in the category of brother, we are to be very, very careful, because we are weaker and more susceptible to falling than we think. Godliness towards each other in practice, getting our relationships right. Secondly, appropriately caring for those in real need. Now, verses 3 to 16, I think they are quite hard to figure out. Partly because it feels a bit like we're listening to one side of a telephone conversation. Sarah, when she's on the telephone to one of our nieces, I'll hear her say something and I'll think, what? And indeed later on I'll say to her, what's happened? Why did you say that? And frankly, she'll explain to me, and sometimes I still haven't got a clue, because she's talking to my 20-year-old niece who is on a completely different planet to I am. So I still haven't got a clue what she meant. But that is what is going on here, isn't it? We are listening in on one side of a conversation between Paul and planet Ephesus in AD 60, which is completely different from planet Hanford in AD 2024. So from just one side of the conversation, we need to work out what's going on at the other end of the line. So what was going on in Ephesus? What can we learn from this passage that was going on? Well, firstly, there were widows. And because of mortality rates, there were many, many more younger widows than we would expect to see today in our Western culture. And secondly, the socio-economics of that time, the lack of a state welfare system, the lack of life insurance, meant that a widow lost not only their husband, they lost their income, they lost their place. But the church in Ephesus, it seems, took seriously the teaching of the Bible that God is fiercely protective of the widow and the orphan. And so the church there started to seriously provide for the widows within their number. But very quickly, the church, which had limited resources, became to be seen as a soft touch. So families who should have been providing for their family member indeed, more of that in a moment, basically said, well, if the church is going to give them money, that lets us off the hook. And indeed, some of the younger widows themselves, some of the younger widows, instead of doing the hard job of rebuilding their lives, essentially thought, well, I never need to work again, do I? This is a gravy train. The church are going to give me money. Hence, some of the quite tough words that Paul uses, and you probably raised your eyebrows to when Deb was reading, about them becoming idle and busybodies. Now, I find this quite hard reading, and I imagine the church in Ephesus did too, because our hearts rightly go out to people who have experienced hardship. But there is a realism that we are not called to help everyone in the same way, and indeed we have limited resources, and dare I say it, we have a limited responsibility. Hence my heading, appropriately caring for those in real need. Verse 3, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. Verse 4, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. Note that sentence. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Now, our context is very different from first century Ephesus, but nevertheless we would want to retain the principle that if one of our number is in real need, we have an obligation. Now, I genuinely think that we as a church are quite alert to this. I often see and hear of real acts of kindness and generosity amongst us. I do hear of shopping being quietly and sensitively paid for, of cheques being written, of gifts being made. And I've certainly heard of countless practical acts of love and kindness. And I think we should be encouraged. What an encouragement that things like that go on here. And what an encouragement for us each to continually, quietly and sensitively help out financially where we see need amongst us. Godliness towards each other in practice. Getting our relationships right. Appropriately caring for those in real need. But thirdly, Paul so underlines the responsibility we have for our own families. Verse 8 couldn't really be clearer, could it? Verse 8, Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, part of me wants to say, well, this goes without saying, doesn't it? But as we know, in our society, this is becoming increasingly problematic. Because as our parents live longer and as they develop more age-related medical conditions, and as our society becomes more me-centred, and as engaging with my family is more and more optional in our society. However, I, as you, do periodically see amazing acts of love and sacrifice by adult children. As I'm sure you have seen, I've seen people put their careers on hold. I've seen adult children camp on the floor, do excessive motorway miles, have their lives changed forever because mum or dad moves in. What does God make of this? Please note the end of verse 4 for your encouragement. This is pleasing to God. But in turn, can I just turn that around? Because it does place an obligation on us as we get older, doesn't it? If our children have a God-given obligation to look out for us, we need to let them. We need to make it easy for them. Often, we can become more of a burden by insisting on our own independence. Into our old age, God has made us to become more dependent. And to stubbornly fight that is not pleasing to God. Godliness towards each other in practice. Getting our relationships right, caring for those in real need, remembering our responsibility to our own families, our responsibility, yes, to look after our elderly parents, but also the responsibility we have to our children to let them look after us. And fourthly, and this is very lovely, encouraging each other in ministry to the very end. Back to our widows in Ephesus, specifically our older widows. And of course we need to remember that 2,000 years ago, if you were 60, you were old. 2,000 years ago, if you were 60, you were in your last years. Verse 9, Paul writes, no widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. Now, here is the point. These ladies, who the rest of society will have started to put on the scrap heap, these ladies who the church are finding ways to substantially support financially, what are these ladies now doing? They are finding ways to serve their Lord and their Lord's church. Isn't that wonderful? They've lost their husband. They have no children or grandchildren to support them. The church are giving them money to help them survive, but their church are also giving them what they need to thrive. We are valuing you, the church is saying. We are honouring you, not just because it's our obligation, but because of your lifetime of experience and wisdom and service and devotion and godliness. And we so need to continue to benefit from that. The rest of the world is starting to write you off. The rest of the world are saying you're not contributing, you're a drain. But we, God's church, have a different perspective. You have what money can't buy. You have what only age and often suffering can buy. You have wisdom and patience and a lifetime of getting it wrong and finding grace. You have a lifetime of struggling before the Lord and finding the peace that transcends understanding. Your remaining years need not be meaningless or pointless or a drain. No, they can be fruitful right up to the second that the Lord calls you home. We want to encourage you, older person, physically weaker person, mentally slower person, because we still need you. And the Lord has still called you. And we will honour you. So how are we in Hanford Church to relate well to each other? Verse 1, do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your brother. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, with absolute purity. Getting our relationships right. Appropriately caring for those in real need. Remembering our responsibility to our own families. Encouraging each other in ministry to the very end.